Hi, I'm Rachel Rudolph, the Extension Vegetable Specialist at the University of Kentucky, and today we're going to discuss crop rotation options in high tunnels. Tomatoes are the highest value high tunnel crop per square foot, which encourages repeated plantings of tomatoes and a lack of crop rotation. Lack of crop rotation leads to high tunnels being unused or underutilized throughout the year. It can also lead to fertilizer building up and nutrient imbalances in the soil, and it can increase pest and disease pressure. There are other profitable crops that we can rotate with tomato, so let's discuss. Crop rotation is the sequence of crops grown in a specific location, including cash crops, cover crops, green manures, really anything. It is the changing of crops over both space or location and time. Crop rotation options are possible in high tunnels, but do require planning. Why is crop rotation so important? There's an improvement of soil quality, improvement of soil fertility, and better management of pests and diseases. You can rotate based off plant family, nutrient requirements, host suitability to certain pests and diseases, rooting depth and type, or the needed cover crops or green manures. There are limitations. The number of high tunnels that a grower has would be one of the main limitations to rotating in a high tunnel. So one high tunnel would limit the amount and the time that you could rotate. But with more tunnels, more rotation options are possible. Your market is also going to limit what kind of crops you can rotate with because you still need to be profitable. Your motivation or your interest in different types of crops, as there may be a learning curve to rotating to a new crop. The time you have to devote to these other crops and this crop rotation, and of course the labor. There may be a learning curve, as I said, and just the time it takes to take care of a different crop. There are many rotational options for high tunnels. Within one high tunnel, you can rotate among the different beds in that high tunnel. So similar crops every year, but in different locations within that one tunnel. This does have the potential to be very high maintenance as far as different fertility requirements and different irrigation requirements among the different crops within that one high tunnel. There's interseasonal rotation, so rotate between seasons within the same calendar year. So spring, summer, fall, winter, you'd have a different crop every season. It may help with soil fertility management and may help break some of the pest and disease cycle issues up, but ultimately one different rotation a year or just rotating each season, but ultimately coming back to the same crop in the spring, for example, would probably not be enough to completely break the pest and disease cycle if that is what you're dealing with. This can also be done in one high tunnel. Then there is a multi-year rotational option. So this would require at least 2 high tunnels in order to maintain a tomato crop every year, if that is your goal. There are a lot of options for rotations in this case, and you're able to stretch the amount of time that the same crop would be in the same place, and that is best for breaking that pest and disease cycle. And then you can also introduce cover crops. Here's a diversified cropping example for the spring season in one high tunnel. So this would be rotating among the beds inside one high tunnel. Each rectangle represents a bed in the high tunnel. Early spring is a good season for cooler season crops with less days to maturity, or early planted warmer season crops with more days to maturity, such as tomato. Row cover may be required depending on the temperature at this time of year, so I would have that handy. But here are some examples. So beets, radish, and kale and carrots are fairly few days to maturity, and they are cool season crops. So planting them in, for Kentucky, this would be mid-March, and then they would be out within 60 days. Broccoli is a little maybe longer days to maturity, but also very cold tolerant. And then we have tomato planted later in the spring and would most likely need row cover while maintaining these other crops that are more cold hardy. Here is a diversified cropping example for the summer season. So for summer, it is important to choose crops that can withstand high air temperatures because the air temperature inside of a high tunnel can easily be 20 degrees Fahrenheit more compared to the open field. Make sure there is plenty of access to water for consistent irrigation. There are several warm season crops that can only be grown at this time of year without supplemental heating. Summer squash being one of them. Also peppers and cucumbers. So here the beets came out from the spring and summer squash is here. Cucumber is another high value crop per square foot, not quite as high as tomato, but high, and it benefits from the protection of that high tunnel as it can have a lot of foliar diseases, which can be more present in the field with rain and high humidity. It's still something that is a concern in the high tunnel, but is more easily prevented and managed in a high tunnel. Peppers replace broccoli, so that is an unrelated crop following broccoli. Broccoli is in the cole crop family. Pepper is in the solanaceous family. Kale was here where summer squash is, right? So again, two different crop families. And lettuce following carrots. Here's a diversified cropping example for the fall season. Fall is a good time to grow cole crops such as broccoli and cauliflower because they are cold hardy. They aren't quite as profitable per square foot as tomato or cucumbers, but they are a good rotation because they are unrelated and therefore may have different diseases or pests, and so can help break that disease cycle for tomatoes or peppers or cucumbers. It's also a good time to grow cooler season crops that require fewer days to maturity because less sunlight and cooler temperatures, crops will slow down and perhaps not be as productive, and so you want things that are going to mature quickly before it gets too cold or too dark. Here is a winter example. Winter may be a good time to either take a break from growing and get your high tunnel ready for spring, and you can utilize cover crops in this instance with cereal rye. Winter may also be a good time to have a chance to build organic matter. Many cold hardy crops can be grown in a high tunnel, but even with cold hardy crops in the middle of winter, you may need row cover. Brussels sprouts have long days to maturity, so those are still there from the fall. Lettuce and kale can be maintained in the winter with row cover. Here's an example of an interseasonal rotation. So this is within the same year, but two different seasons inside the same high tunnel. So in the spring, summer, you have tomato, and in the fall and winter, you have different types of greens, lettuce and kale. Here's another option. You still have your spring, summer tomatoes, and then you rotate to fall flowers, which are completely unrelated to tomatoes. Here's a 3-season interseasonal rotation, including late winter, early spring greens such as lettuce and kale, spring, summer tomatoes, and fall, winter cole crops. Here is another option with spring, summer tomatoes and late summer, fall, winter cover cropping. So for multi-year rotations, there are many more rotational options with more than one tunnel. You can have more success with managing soil fertility, pest and disease, with longer rotations. Planning is required, and you probably need to take really good notes and even draw out a map of your different rotations for each year and have a plan in place for the next rotation, maybe several rotations in advance. Here is an option for a multi-year rotation if a grower were to have 2 high tunnels. The goal here in this example would be for the grower to be able to have tomatoes and cucumbers every year without fail, but still maintain a solid rotation. So we're looking at rotating outside of plant family to manage pests and disease, rooting depth, and managing different soil fertility. Lettuce is a lighter feeder, requires less soil fertility than tomatoes, for example, and cucurbits, specifically cucumbers. So let's say in tunnel 1 in year 1, we have greens, tomatoes, and cole crops. And at the same time in tunnel 2, we have root crops, cucurbits, and greens. So this would be late winter, early spring, spring and summer, and fall rotation for tunnel 1, and the same thing in tunnel 2. Root crops would be late winter, early spring, cucurbits or cucumbers would be spring, summer, and greens would be a fall, potentially into the winter crop. So as you see, year 1, 2, and 3 have a different rotation, and tomatoes do not occur again until the 3rd year. So you have a full 2 years between tomatoes being in the same high tunnel. And the same thing with cucumbers. Here's an example if someone had 3 high tunnels. So you'd have an even longer rotational option. So greens, tomatoes, and root crops in year 1 in tunnel 1, while cole crops, cucurbits, and greens in tunnel 2 in year 1, and tunnel 3 could have root crops, beans, and cole crops. There are years where beans can be extremely profitable. This would be something to take into consideration, as beans can grow really well outside, as can cole crops. So that is a consideration that each grower will need to make for themselves, as far as, is this the best option in my high tunnel at this time? Year 2, cole crops, beans, and greens, or flowers. So many flowers are also in the Asteraceae family, which a lot of lettuce is as well. And so that is something a grower would need to consider. What flowers are they growing? What greens are they growing? Can they be rotated together, or do they need to be considered essentially the same family and be rotated separately? But flowers in the fall could be very profitable depending on what you're growing, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Of course, flowers can be grown in the spring, but that may sacrifice your cucumbers or tomato crop. So it would depend on what your priority is. Crop management should be seriously considered when thinking about high tunnel rotations. You can put anything in a high tunnel, but should you? Many crops grow very well out in the open field and are not well suited for the high tunnel because they take up a lot of space but aren't as profitable. Crop spacing is usually closer in the high tunnel than in the open field. Tighter spacing, though, may lead to more disease and pest pressure. And this is something to consider when laying out your high tunnel and planning how many beds and how many plants per bed will be in the high tunnel. Make sure to leave room for harvesting and make sure that you can manage what you're putting in the high tunnel. Transplanting versus direct seeding is a consideration. Growing transplants or buying transplants is obviously more expensive than direct seeding crops into the ground. But transplants give you at least a few weeks jump start on the season, and once they're there, you can manage them. Whereas for a direct seeded crop, you need to wait and see if it germinates, and a lot can happen in between those 10 days, 2 weeks while the crop is germinating and emerging from the soil. Consider crops that allow for multiple harvests. This is what helps make tomatoes so profitable per square foot, is that it has many harvests. You can get 25, 30 pounds of tomatoes from one plant versus a cabbage, for example, is a one harvest crop. It takes up a lot of space, it's low growing, and it's one single harvest. Also consider what you can physically manage. What does your time and your labor allow you to manage? Make use of the whole high tunnel when possible. Grow vertically. Balance labor and time. Other aspects of crop management include planting windows, so successional planting or seeding for continuous availability if that's how your market is set up. So for example, if you need lettuce for an extended period of time, you may need to plan successional planting for continuous lettuce during an extended part of the year. Staggered planting every 1 or 2 weeks. And again, this depends on your labor and your market demands and the crop. So maybe it's every 3 weeks rather than every 1 week. It really depends on the crop and how it matures. Influences on timing of rotation should be taken into consideration. So termination of one crop to plant another, sometimes that can be a really tight window. If you're terminating a tomato crop and need to get started for the fall, for example, or late summer, that can be a very tight window. But it's important to think about how well that tomato crop is doing if you planted it in April, by mid-August, it's most likely not being very productive. And so knowing when to pull that crop out and put in a more profitable crop is an important decision to be able to make. The weather and the climate are going to influence the timing of rotation, daylight hours, your market, and your labor. Here's an example of fall flowers. My lab has been doing rotational work in high tunnels for several years, and we have experimented with fall fresh cut flowers. Our parameters were that they needed to be short days to maturity, so 60 days or less. They needed to be unrelated, of course, to tomatoes because we were trying to do a rotation that would be unrelated to the tomato crop to try to break pest and disease cycles. And we also wanted them to be fairly low in their fertility needs. So we've looked at zinnias, amaranth, straw flowers, cosmos, and sunflowers. All these flowers on the sides were transplanted. Sunflowers can be successfully direct seeded. And we direct seeded them in 3 different week plantings. So 1 week we planted this first part, the second week we seeded the second part, and then the third week we seeded the last part. So we were purposefully experimenting with successional planting. Here's a close-up of the different flowers we grew. The amaranth, the zinnias, and the cosmos. Color is an important component of growing flowers, and so that is something to take into consideration. If you're new to flower production, definitely think about the season and the colors and what you're going to be doing with those flowers. Are you going to be selling them to a florist? If so, then consult with that florist about what colors they want at certain times of the year. Are you going to be making bouquets yourself? There are different considerations to make. Here are the different sunflowers we've grown over time: White Knight, Red, and Bicolor, all from the Pro Cut series, which are shorter days to maturity. Straw Flower, and we've even done Calendula one year. As I said previously, many flower species are in the same family as lettuce, which is Asteraceae. And so definitely take that into consideration with your crop rotation. Pest and disease management for flowers is very important, as there is little to no room for imperfection. Blooms essentially need to be perfect, stems need to be pretty straight, and we cannot have disease or powdery mildew showing on the petals. Flowers do have maybe mid-level fertility requirements compared to tomato, or at least the flowers we've grown in the fall. Trellising is fairly important in order to keep the stem straight and protect from the wind, even in a high tunnel. Harvests are frequent and continuous. One could easily harvest 3 times a week for flowers, which is definitely something to consider from the labor and time management standpoint. Considerations with flowers, if you're new to this, would be, will they be the focus of your high tunnel production or just part of the rotation with vegetable crops? What season would be the main flower growing season? Spring, summer, fall? Will things overwinter? Will value added be part of your flower production? So will you be making bouquets or arrangements, or will you be selling them to someone else to do that? And then of course your available time, labor, and resources for flower production. And do you have access to a market for your flowers? These types of considerations you should think about with all your vegetable crops too, certainly. But for vegetable growers who are familiar with vegetable production, jumping into unfamiliar territory, flowers may come as a surprise with all the considerations. Other rotation options to think about: always consider unrelated or out of family crops to be added to your rotation that would still be quote unquote worth putting in the high tunnel. Again, consider the value of that infrastructure and if it's genuinely better to put something in a high tunnel versus growing in an open field. High value crops that will add and improve to the rotation. So garlic grows well outside, but alliums may be something to consider as part of a rotation. Herbs can be high value. Strawberries, that is something that many people have grown in a high tunnel, but they share many diseases with solanaceous crops. They also do not grow vertically. So although you can get multiple harvests, they do take up a lot of space on the ground in a high tunnel. Also consider space management, days to maturity, multiple or single harvests, and of course, your market. Planning for crop rotations should include thinking about issues that you're already dealing with, such as diseases or pests, right? Soil-borne diseases in particular, or plant parasitic nematodes. Sanitation will be very important when moving from one rotation to the next, one crop to the next. You want to clean everything, clean out the high tunnel, get the weeds out, and any old plant material that should be removed from the high tunnel. Soil fertility and soil sampling will be very important. I recommend soil sampling at least once per year between plantings and seasons, and potentially 2 or 3 times if you really want to dial it in. Understanding and interpreting the soil test results are even more important than just the sampling itself. We have a lot of high tunnel related resources. There's a few flower videos if you're interested in more in flowers, and there's several cover cropping videos if that is of interest. There is a fact sheet about our project, rotating cut flowers within a high tunnel production system. Our website is vegcrops.ca.uky.edu. ID 36 is the Commercial Vegetable Growers Handbook. ID 235 is the Scouting Guide for high tunnels. And of course, the UK Center for Crop Diversification has current prices and many crop profiles for you to make your considerations for crop rotations. We also have a high tunnel planting calendar for annual crops. Make sure to select the region where you are located. We have 3, region 1, 2, and 3. So be sure to check that out because the recommendations will differ. There is the minimum air temperature for each crop and the optimal air temperature range, and then the 4 weeks for each month, and the direct seeding recommendation, the transplant recommendation, and the harvest window.